Hello Year 10, Mr. Whitehead here from my house with the third lesson that we've been doing since school's closure. Now this lesson is going to be based on the topic which is on your screen now, narrative and binary opposites. Okay, now this is a new topic, so once again you're going to have to make notes. You're going to have to make sure that you listen carefully to these videos because I'm teaching you new things here. So I appreciate it that it is quite difficult, but judging from your feedback from the lessons so far and some of the notes that you've been taking in your books whilst you've been going along through these lessons, it does seem to be working. So I'm going to continue down that manner. Okay. Now, as ever, these lessons are going to be 2 weeks long, so starting from today, which is the 12th of May, up until the 26th of May, which would be within half term, or you can do it until the Friday before that. Okay, so that's the duration of how long I want you to spend finishing this video lesson. Just want to remind you though, before you continue with this video, if you haven't completed the lessons on iconography and stock characters before starting this lessons, stop here before you carry on. Go back, go onto the YouTube channel, go back through your emails and find those two lessons before you start this lesson. And also make sure that you complete the assignments at the end of those video lessons on iconography and on stock characters before you start this, because some of this won't make sense unless you've done those two. So, what you'll need, as ever, you'll need 4 things to complete this video lesson. First and foremost, you'll need your creative media book or some A4 line paper, which is also absolutely fine. You'll need a pen, okay, so you can take notes, you can complete the activities and the questions that I'm going to ask you. You'll also need access to your emails or the VLE, because that's where I am sending resources and worksheets that are attached to this lesson. And also you'll need access to PowerPoint or Microsoft Word, so at the end of this lesson, when I take you through the assignments, you're able to complete the assignment section for this video lesson. Okay? Okay, moving on. So, as I said, today's new topic that I'm going to take you through is narrative. So that's the first part of the lesson. Today is going to be focused on narrative. So please make sure that you are taking notes during this, during these slides, because essentially you need to understand what this is in order to complete that assignment. Okay, so it's really, really important that you are taking notes and making sure you're engaged in what I'm saying here. So first and foremost, what is narrative? So in media studies, narrative is often how the story of a media text is created and then how it relays its information to the audience. Now, you've probably heard the word storyline, story, a lot more frequently than you have the word narrative, okay? But they are very, very similar things. A narrative is essentially the same as a storyline. It's just what in media studies, we call it narrative instead of storyline, okay? So it's basically how that story is created, okay? And then obviously, after that story is created, it then has to be relayed to the audience, okay? So that's what a narrative is. So in order to analyse how a narrative is constructed, how a narrative is created, we need to look at how it's put together, all right? So it's put together using 5 different things. First and foremost, it's put together using a camera, all right? So the storyline and the idea might be there, but without the camera, without different camera shots, without different camera angles, without different camera movements, we wouldn't actually be able to visibly see it, okay? So that's why it's so important that that camera is an element and it constructs and creates narrative. The next one is mise en scène, okay? So this one is particularly important, I believe, okay? And that's what's basically within each of the shots, all right? So if you have an idea about a storyline and it's based in a school, without that school setting, without that school's props, without school uniforms, and without children, without teenage actors, it wouldn't look like a school. So therefore you couldn't actually create that narrative, all right? So just like in your past practical assignments. That's why I made sure that you all chose the setting and the location of your storyline, your film, your narrative was within a school, because that was what was accessible to us. Okay, so it's really, really important that you understand that mise-en-scène and everything that's within a frame also helps create and construct a narrative. The third thing is sound. So that can mean dialogue, it can mean the actors talking to each other, it can mean the background music, okay? Obviously, without dialogue and without characters interacting, it'd be very difficult for a narrative to go forward and to drive forward, okay? So the sound and the narrative and the dialogue and the speech, that really, really drives forward that narrative. The next thing, the fourth thing, is the structure. Now I'm going to take you through over the next few slides about different narrative structures, okay? I'm going to take you through numerous of those, so they'll become a little bit clear as I continue through the lesson. Then the fifth one, and the reason that's in green is because we've already done this. So without characters, without those stock characters, the characters that you would expect to see within a genre, okay, it's also going to be very difficult to construct and create that narrative, okay, and put that narrative together. Okay, so in a superhero film, for example, two characters which are absolutely essential is a hero and a villain. Okay, without those two characters, that narrative isn't going to be constructed. Okay, so that's a way of how characters can construct narratives. So please make sure you've taken notes on that slide. I'm going to move on just in a second. Okay, so an example of narrative. Now, you might think a narrative has to be always fictional if you're thinking of a storyline, but I just want to make sure and make it clear to you that that's not always the case. So the example of narrative that I'm going to show you is from a television news program. All right, now BBC News at 10, I'm sure you are all familiar with that. All right, I'm sure you're all familiar, especially during these quite testing times. I'm sure you've probably been watching the news more often than maybe you would have usually done before this pandemic and before schools closure. But BBC News at 10, a factual news program like that, also has a narrative, okay? So that narrative and the way that that narrative is constructed is the same every single night, okay? Every single evening at 10 o'clock on the BBC, the same narrative is constructed for BBC News at 10. Obviously, though, the big difference is the news content is different, okay? So, because if they just showed the same news stories every single night, no one would watch it, okay? Because it's already been and gone. So the way that that narrative is constructed, the top stories or the breaking news is at the start of the program, what they view as being the most important news story, okay? And then after that, it continues with more stories, okay? More of the day's news, okay, and then finally towards the end we then get the sport, and then finally it's finished off with the weather, okay. So realistically, it's broken down into kind of four sections. The first section is the breaking news or the top news story. The second section is the rest of the news stories and the continuing news stories. And then we've kind of, at the end, we've got the sports news, and then finally finishes with the weather, okay. So it follows that kind of four-part narrative construction every single evening, because the audience, as an audience, we are familiar with that. That's the way that we view our news in this country. So what's also important to know is to note down really is that this news is created because of those five things, on this slide here. Okay, so we expect to see the same camera shots, angles, and movements. We expect to see the same studio setting. We expect to hear the same sort of tone of voice and facial expressions of the newsreader. We also expect the newsreader to appear quite formal and professional, wearing a suit and tie. Okay, so it's really, really important that it uses the same consistent technical codes and and audio codes as well, and it does do that. Okay, so as I've said, the audio codes that we expect to hear quite typically is the starting theme tune, and then simply the dialogue and the voice of the news presenter and all the news reporters as well. All right, that is essentially what we expect to see. Okay, So that's just one example really that I wanted to take you through in regards to narrative, just so you're aware that it's not always a story, it's not always a storyline. A narrative can be a way in which a program or a film can be structured and constructed. Okay, so that's just an easy example which I thought I could take you through. And it's exactly the same with every single superhero film. Okay, so I'm going to take you through now the various different narrative structures that there are within film and TV. Okay, so different types of narrative, different types of narrative structures. So the first one I'm going to take you through is what's called a linear narrative. So please make a note of this within your books. It's really important that you understand what a linear narrative is. So this is the most common type of narrative structure. All right. Now this basically simply means this is a narrative which moves forward in a chronological order, with one action following after another. Okay? Dead, straightforward. It's a narrative which follows in time order. Dead easy. Okay? So, as I said, the program will follow in the correct order of time, and it will include no flashbacks or flash forwards. Okay? They have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Now, what's really important is that your narrative, your superhero film, it may follow a chronological and time order, but if it includes any flashbacks or if it includes any flash forwards, then it's not a linear narrative. Okay, it's not a linear narrative. It cannot contain a flashback or a flash forward if it's a linear narrative. So I thought I'd pick out a really easy example just to get you familiar with what a linear narrative may look like. Soap operas. So if you watch Coronation Street, EastEnders, Hollyoaks, whatever, all soap operas, they follow a linear narrative where it moves forward with the storyline in chronological order. It moves with time. Dead easy. So what I want you to do now is just spend a quick 5 minutes. There are 2 questions at the bottom in red. So first and foremost, does your film or is your superhero film in chronological order? Is it in time order? Okay. Or does your superhero film contain any flashbacks and flash forwards? Quick, nice and easy. Second one, does your superhero film have a clear beginning, middle, and end, do you think? So 5 minutes in your books, on the line paper, off you go. All right, fantastic. I'm hoping you have managed to answer those 2 questions fairly comfortably in red there. If you haven't, just pause the video, go back and do that. Now moving on to essentially the opposite of what we've just gone through. So we've had a linear narrative, which is a film which follows chronological and time order. I'm now going to take you through what a non-linear narrative is. All right. So a non-linear narrative is a structure essentially where the story is told in a non-chronological order, okay, where it doesn't follow time or a specific order. All right. So a non-linear narrative may contain flashbacks. Now that's probably the most common way in which you can discover and find out if your film has a non-linear narrative. If it contains a flashback, then it is a non-linear narrative, because what it's essentially doing is stopping the time right there and going all the way back to maybe the childhood of a character or whatever. Okay, so that's one way, and that makes it non-linear. Another thing that some films do, some superhero films do anyway, is they might start with a flashback. Okay, so it might start with something which happened 20 years ago. Okay, or 5 years ago, which is gonna potentially come back and remind us somewhere within the film at some point, or it might actually do the opposite of a flashback and something which is called a flash forward. It might start 20 years in the future, and then the film is essentially following time order up until that point 20 years later on. Okay, so that's just 2 examples and ways in which a non-linear narrative can occur within a film. Okay, so they often show flashbacks. They show clips from the character's past that the audience hasn't already seen. Okay, and I'm going to take you through in a bit more detail about flashbacks on the next few slides. But as I said as well, they could also contain flash forwards where we see into the character's future. Also, what's important to note down is that the storyline may not always start with the start and it may not always finish with the end, okay? So I've given you some examples of where that happens. Basically, all you need to know is about nonlinear narratives is that it's essentially not told in chronological or time order, all right? That's all you need to know. There's no specific order. It's almost kind of jumbled all over the place, okay? It has bits from the past, it has bits from the future, but it's kind of mixed together, all right? But it does usually come together at the end. Okay, so a key part of non-linear narratives, which is what I imagine the vast majority of your chosen superhero films are, a key part of that are flashbacks, okay? So if you didn't know what a flashback was, a flashback is a scene that takes the story and the narrative back in time from the current point in the story, okay? So that's just its simple definition there, okay? Now the reason why films include flashbacks is to essentially provide the audience with some extra information, okay? This is usually about the past of a character, which helps drive the story on, okay? So I imagine now you're thinking of some of your actual film choices and films that you've seen where you can remember a flashback within them, and it really helps the audience almost build a relationship with that character because we start to understand things from their perspective, from their point of view. So, as I said, it really helps drive the story as it helps build and develop an audience relationship with that character because we are in touch then with their emotions, okay? We see things almost through their eyes, okay? Whether it's a memory, a moment of nostalgia, which is significant to them, and it makes us as an audience almost kind of resonate and feel the same way about that certain thing. So the purpose of a flashback, the reason why flashbacks are used, is essentially to either reveal more information about a character or to move the story forward. All right, now I'm going to show you an example here. So I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the film Ratatouille. I hope you are because it's a fantastic film. But I'm going to show you this flashback here now in the film Ratatouille. So just quickly, we will watch this together.
Ratatouille? They must be joking.
Okay, so an example there of a flashback in the Disney film Ratatouille. So I now want you to focus on what you've just watched there, okay? From the information that I've just given you previously about the reasons why flashbacks are used. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the film. If you have seen the film, these two questions will be slightly easier. But I want you to answer those two questions in red below there, okay, underneath the video. So the first one reads, how does this flashback make the audience feel about this character? Okay? And the second one is, how do we now view this character differently within the film? Okay, so I want you to just think about, if you haven't seen the film, I want you to think about the difference between when we see the character who looks like this in the film in relation to when we see the character when he looks like that. All right, so that might help you understand how we might, as an audience, now view this character slightly differently than before. So pause the video, 5 minutes spending on those 2 red questions. All right, fantastic. I'm hoping you have now managed to jot some ideas down, okay, about how that character might now be viewed differently. So I'm just going to take you through some of my ideas, basically. So just to make sure that we kind of get, the same sort of understanding of how that flashback is used effectively within that film. So if you haven't seen this film, before the flashback, Anton Ego, who is the food critic who we saw eating the ratatouille, he is viewed and depicted in quite an evil way. All right, he's always wearing black. He has quite a stern, blank, scary facial expression at all times within the film. Okay, and he also has quite a cold blue tone. Okay, not just his skin tone, but in a lot of the scenes that he's in within the film, it's got that kind of blue tone to it, which we've discussed in previous lessons about. It kind of makes the audience feel uncomfortable. All right, that's because he's almost seen as almost like the evil character, the villain almost within the film. However, as soon as Anton Ego puts the food in his mouth and when the flashback occurs, the audience now views that character in a totally different way. All right. And this is how it does it. So the flashback takes us back to Anton Ego's childhood, all right, where we almost emotionally connect with that character. Okay, we view him, we sympathise with him. We look at his kind of sad facial expression when he opens the door. We may kind of start to think about whether he was potentially lonely as a child, not really having many friends, that sort of thing, and we start to actually begin to understand a bit more about this character, and it develops our relationship with this character, okay, because we're finding out more about him. All right, so this flashback also, if you've not noticed, has a very warm coloured tone to it as well. So it has what's called a sepia tone, that kind of yellow overtone, which is totally different than how he was viewed previously in that cold blue tone. All right, so again, that kind of warmth, it makes us as an audience view that character totally differently. We almost feel comfortable around him now, and you'll see that if you have watched the film, the way in which that character develops after that flashback is totally different than how he was viewed before. He's almost gone from being the evil, scary, blank facial expressioned old man to almost kind of this new, totally new character. And us as an audience, we actually see him in a lot more positive light. So flashbacks in superhero films, I just thought I'd make a quick note so you're able to essentially transfer that knowledge, what we just discussed, over to what you are going to note down in your assignment at the end. So flashbacks are really common within superhero films, okay? So I've got down a little statistic here that 14 of the 22 Marvel Cinematic Universe films, okay, so that's what ends with Avengers Endgame, they open with a flashback. So 2/3 of the Marvel films, the first scene is a flashback. So that says a lot about how important flashbacks are within superhero films. So they use them and they heavily rely on them because this technique helps the audience develop an understanding of that superhero's past. Without this flashback, without understanding what that character has been through, we aren't able to develop a close relationship with that character. So it's really important that superhero films use flashbacks so we can emotionally connect and sympathize with that character. Okay, so as you know, superhero films follow usually the storyline of one main character, one main protagonist, the superhero. All right, and usually superheroes, they experience some sort of trauma. All right, so something bad happens within their lives, and often these flashbacks help us kind of understand how that character views a certain event in his life, okay, and then it helps us as an audience almost relate to him a lot more. We become close, so therefore it makes us almost root for that character and root for that superhero throughout the film. Okay, so the next narrative structure, the next type of narrative structure that I'm going to take you through is what's called a single strand narrative. All right, so again, this is something new. Please make sure that you're taking notes and you understand what this single strand narrative is, because you will have to come back to this when you start your assignment. So a single strand narrative is a story which is focused usually on just one single character. Usually this is the main character, and it focuses on them from the beginning to the very, very end. All right. Now, a single strand narrative is the most common narrative type which is used in superhero films, okay? Because we tend to follow the main superhero within that film. We follow the story of just one main character, all right? So if that's the case in your superhero films that you've chosen, just make sure that you take a note of that this is that type of narrative structure in which your film uses. It's a single strand narrative. Now, if it's not a single strand narrative and it follows other characters as well, that's what's called then a multi-strand narrative, all right? So a multi-strand narrative is telling a story from several main characters' perspectives, okay? And all of them have their kind of own small storylines which overlap to create the overall film narrative in the end, all right? So as I said, these storylines usually collide together and they overlap, which the audiences see for themselves from their own perspective. So we're almost seeing, it's a film here really where there's multiple main characters, all right? So this is the case in several of the Marvel films, okay? Especially the Avengers films, if you are familiar with those, all right? We're essentially following the story of several main characters, okay? I think it's fair to say that the two main Avengers, you would probably argue, are Iron Man and Captain America, but we do also follow the narrative from multiple other characters' perspectives as well, where we see kind of like the background story to that character, and we see the individual characters as their kind of individual superheroes, and that's when they all kind of assemble together to create the Avengers. That's what's just called a multiple strand narrative, all right? So if one of your film choices is the Avengers, then it's likely that you will be talking about multi-strand narratives in your assignment. But if you haven't and you've just got your singular superhero, then make sure that you make a note that it's a single strand narrative, okay? So it's either one of the two, it's not going to be both. So what I want you to do now is a quick activity, all right? So based on the information that I have just given you about linear and non-linear narratives, about flashbacks, and about single and multi-strand narratives, I want you to use the narrative task worksheet, okay, which is attached to the email. This worksheet is also available on the VLE, and I would like you to answer the questions based on narrative and narrative structure about your two chosen superhero films, all right? So as I keep saying, these tasks here on these worksheets that I'm creating for you, they're to set you up ready for the assignment, all right? So at the end of this video lesson, I'm going to take you through the assignment and the narrative slides, all right? So if you complete these activities to the best of your ability and in the most detail as you can, it will really, really help you for the assignment at the end of this video, because it's essentially setting you up. If you do the work now in detail in these activities, it will make your life far, far easier at the end of it, all right? So I recommend you probably spend around about 20 to 30 minutes on this task, okay? So if you want to print the sheet out, okay? But it is attached on the email and the VLE, as I said. So pause the video and off you go with this worksheet. Okay, Year 10s, I'm hoping you've managed to complete that task on narrative, and it's given you a pretty good idea about those three things that we've discussed really. So whether the narrative is either linear or non-linear, whether it contains flashbacks and some details about those flashbacks, and then also, of course, about whether it's a single or multi-strand narrative as well. So I'm now going to take you through the second part of this video lesson, and it's about this theory of binary opposites. Okay, now this theorist is really easy to understand. Okay, it's just essential that you do understand it before we move on. So the theory of binary opposites is essentially that all narratives have to be driven by a conflict of opposites. Okay, so for example, the most easy and the most obvious example is the fact that there is a conflict between a hero and a villain, and that's what drives the narrative forward. That's what drives the storyline forward. Okay, now this conflict of opposites between those two characters, that happens until finally there is a balance between the two, or the resolution is achieved, whether it's been resolved. Okay, so it might be by the hero defeating the villain, it might be by the villain maybe joining the hero on his side, whatever your film may be. But that is essentially what it is in its most simple form. Okay, but what's important to understand is that binary opposites aren't just hero and villain. There's a lot more out there. Okay, so they're frequently used in films, and they often are the main kind of idea and driving force behind a film's storyline. So binary opposites create a plot for a film, all right? So it creates a storyline where as its most simple form again, where a hero defeats a villain, all right? So they've been said to almost create a balance in narratives and within storylines. So for example, if there wasn't any evil in a horror film, there essentially wouldn't be a horror film storyline. If there wasn't a villain in a superhero film, there wouldn't be a superhero film there, because the superhero hasn't got anyone who he's actually fighting. So these binary opposites are what create the balance within a film. Now I'm going to give you now some examples. All right. Now we've already discussed about hero and villain, but there are loads more examples out there. So for example, there's light and dark. All right, so if you look at the picture on the right hand side, you can see there a clear binary opposition between light and dark, okay, within those two characters. We've also got right and wrong, good and evil, sanity and insanity, human and alien, okay, you might think of various films that you've watched where it's a human versus an alien, young versus old, strength versus weakness, honesty versus some sort of lie, some deceit, and silence against potentially loud noise. So I just wanted to take you now and just have a look at this picture here. Now, from that picture there, you can clearly see an opposition of these two characters. First and foremost, probably the most easy one, which we've discussed already, the fact that this character on the left-hand side is wearing a very light dress, whereas this character on the right is wearing a very dark dress. Okay, so you've got that binary opposition between light and dark. I think also the fact that you've got a female character on the left and a male character on the right. Again, that's a binary opposition. We've got a man and a woman. We've also potentially got a good character on the left-hand side and a bad character or an evil character on the right here. So you can see here that there are really obvious binary oppositions within quite a few films. And just from that picture, I've picked out 3 there for you. All right. So binary oppositions really are quite a simple narrative technique that a lot of producers use, okay? And all it is just there are opposites within a storyline. There is an opposition between two things within a storyline. And it's all basically down to you to understand, first and foremost, what that opposition is, and essentially why that opposition is used, okay, over the next couple of slides. So I'm going to take you now through the actual assignment slide itself, or assignment slides themselves, okay, because there are 2. So the first one is based on all of the narrative questions, it's full of narrative questions which we have covered in the first half of that lesson, okay. So this is the slide that I would like you to complete for the assignment. All right, so it starts off with the question about whether it has a linear or non-linear narrative. So look back to the task that you completed earlier on in the lesson, all right, whether it's got a linear or non-linear narrative. Make sure you note down how you know that, okay? So if you're saying it's a non-linear narrative, you know that because it contains flashbacks or it contains flash forwards. Or if you're saying that it's a linear narrative, say that because it doesn't contain those flashbacks and it follows in a chronological order, okay? So it then asks you about whether your film does contain flashbacks. I want you to go into a bit of detail about those flashbacks. So what happens in them? Why is that flashback used? Again, visit the previous slides. Look at the reasons why I've said flashbacks are used, but just make sure you answer that question in relation to your chosen superhero film. All right. So, how does this flashback make the audience feel about the character? How does it make them connect with that character? Does it potentially make them sympathize with that character in any way? The second bullet point is all about questions in regards to whether there is a single or multi-strand narrative. Again, if you need to go and revisit the slides which I've discussed earlier, then this is your chance to go and do that. All right, but essentially I want you to answer the question, does it have a single or multi-strand narrative? Again, how do you know this? Explain how you know this. Talk about the different storylines which are running through the film. Okay, so the main character might have a love interest. We might see some almost dispute and conflict within the character's family. We might see him in the workplace. We might see him as a part of a team that helps them. It's just to prompt your ideas, and I want you to discuss and tell me about some of the different storylines and narrative strands that there may be within your film. The third one down is all about relationships between characters within the film and about representation. So you've done this in previous lessons, okay? So I want you to talk about how those different characters within the films are represented, whether they are positive and negative representations, whether the audience will be able to almost identify with any of these narratives. So for example, stereotypically, love interest narratives, they appeal to female audiences, okay? Because they can almost relate to that. It's within their interest. I know it's a stereotype, okay? But this is what media is about, drawing and using those stereotypes to your advantage. Moving on, the one below that, I want you to just discuss some ideas about the villain. Now, you are going to move on to the villain in a bit more detail after you have finished that fourth bullet point down, but I just want you to talk about essentially why he's evil, what are the villain's relationship within the film, do we see anything from his perspective, so something in which Avengers Infinity War does incredibly effectively is essentially we view Thanos as not a villain character. We learn about his past. We almost begin to almost sympathize with Thanos about many of his moral code and we're almost questioning whether he is right or wrong, even though he's aiming to destroy 50% of the population. The way in which it does that is very, very clever. So if you have chosen that film, then you will be answering this question quite a lot differently. Okay, but that's just something to consider and something to research about that villain and essentially his backstory and his relationships within the film. Then lastly, it's about how the film ends. The last point is about how the film ends. So tell me, does it close the narrative? Is it over? Or does it set it up for another film? Does it set it up for a sequel? So for example, Iron Man sets up Iron Man 2 right at the very end when he famously claims to be Iron Man in that press conference. So does it leave it on a cliffhanger? So I essentially want you to explain how the film ends. And then that is the narrative slide. So go back if you need to refresh yourselves about those things that we discussed. Make sure you are using those key terms in full sentences when you are answering these questions. Then finally, lastly, is this slide for this week. Now this is just the binary opposition between the superhero and the villain, the hero and the villain. So I want you to essentially recreate this table on a Word document, on a PowerPoint, and essentially be answering those questions about the superhero and about the supervillain. Okay? Think about what binary oppositions is. They are seen to be opposites and conflicting characters. Okay, so make sure that again you provide as much detail as you can. Use those key terms that I've used in those questions in your answers, and you'll be good and well on for a good mark in this, because you should understand what a binary opposite is, and it's fairly straightforward. All right, so that is that for this week. Okay, as ever, any questions, do not hesitate to drop me a line about any of the work that I have set. All right. Make sure that you stay safe. I know the Prime Minister obviously announced that we are going to be off school for a little while longer. So if you do want to drop me a line, or if you're struggling with any of this work, I would rather you contacted me and said it was going to be late than just not contact me at all. I want to hear from you, okay? So please don't hesitate to drop me an email at any time, any day at all. It really makes no difference to me. So that's it, Year 10s. As I said, I would like you to have this work completed over the next 2 weeks. So that's the 12th of May till the 26th of May. And until then, take care of yourselves.